Here's a look at your market recap on this Friday, the 12th day of September. It's Friday, and like always, a lot of information to get through to you today, so we'll just jump right into it. The big reports of this week included the monthly WASDE report as well as the USDA crop production report. We'll take a look at those before we get into the markets. Corn production was revised to be up slightly. They did drop that average corn yield by 2.1 bushels down to 186.7. However, they raised acres a bit, and when all that was taken into account, it looks like corn production is forecast to be at 16.8 billion bushels this year. That would be up 13% from last year. Soybean harvest, they dropped the average yield there slightly from last month to 53.5. Once again, estimated harvested acres were revised up slightly. Overall, though, with the big decrease of acres from last year to this year on the beans, that did drop the overall yield down 2% from last year, with a forecast of 4.30 billion bushels. When everything was said and done, that WASDE and crop production report, the corn was viewed as slightly bullish. Beans would have been slightly bearish. However, some of that bean news was offset by some rumors that we actually shipped the first shipment this year of soybeans to China. So when all was said and done on the futures today, the grains closed quite a bit higher. It was a different story, however, on the cattle markets today as they closed quite a bit lower. And we'll get into that here shortly. First, we'll take a look at the negotiated feedlot trade for the week. As of the 2 o'clock cutoff on Friday afternoon, 53,420 head of confirmed negotiated sales were reported. Trade started early in the week, and it was significantly lower than last week, especially following Tuesday's massive sell-off on the futures markets. As the week progressed, however, though, feedlot managers were able to get a little bit of that money back, and late week negotiated trade was higher than what took place early in the week. That being said, all of the trade was lower than last week's numbers. In Texas, 1,414 head for the week, from 238 early in the week to mostly the 240 late in the week. Kansas reported 3,317 head for the week. Pretty much the same story there, 238 early in the week up to mostly 240 late in the week. And most of that trade in Kansas did wait till later in the week. Iowa reported 17,759 head for the week, 237 up to 240 mostly. Nebraska reported 21,478 head, 237 early up to 240 late. Some dress sales at 375 to 380. Those live sales are going to be somewhere around $2 to $3 lower for the week. The dress sales somewhere around 5 to 7 lower when we get the final numbers next week. Taking a look at some of the stick-out sales from around the auction barns this week, following the holiday shortened week last week and the cooler weather to start the week, ended up with a very good, I guess you could call it an early fall run at the auction barns this week. Going to have somewhere around 38,000 head that went through the sales. Several of the reporters did note a significant increase in the calves, as well as those that would have been considered high health risk due to lack of weaning or shots. Taking a look at the stick-out sales that we wrote down this week, drafts mostly above 20 head. F&T Livestock Market in Palmyra, they reported 35 head of 495-pound steers at $497.50. South Central Regional Stockyards in Vienna, they had a light draft of 518-pound steers at $492.50. The average statewide on those light 5 weights this week at $450 even. Joplin Regional Stockyards, they sold 48 head of 592-pound steers at $460. Callaway Livestock Center had a full load of 601-pound steers at $458. Windsor Livestock Auction, they reported a full load of 704-pound steers at 407.50. The average statewide on those light 7-weight steers this week at 385. Joplin Regional Stockyards reported 31 head of 754-pound steers at 383. Then Unionville Livestock Auction, they had 3 loads of those Rockin' R steers plus another load that fit right in there with them, so ended up with 4 full loads of 873 to 882 pound steers, and they sold from 362 to 366. Joplin Regional Stockyard sold 195 head of 915 pound steers with a price of $352. A few heifer sales this week. 28 head of 506-pound heifers at Kingsville Livestock Auction sold at $448. The statewide average on those light 5-weight heifers this week at $406. F&T Livestock Market in Palmyra had 26 head of 550-pound heifers at $422.50. Windsor Livestock Auction sold 160 head of 661-pound heifers at $394. And then Unionville had 24 head of 747-pound heifers at $384. The average on those light 7-weight heifers this week at $358. Turning our attention now to the cattle futures. Whether it was just another technical sell-off today, nervousness, or perhaps it was some worry about what the Secretary of Agriculture was going to say at her meeting in Oklahoma today regarding the screwworm. Who really knows, but the futures did close significantly sharply lower today as of the recap that we've seen from the Secretary's reports. It didn't look like there was any mention whatsoever of any near-time opening of that border. They laid out a lot of plans to continue to surveillance and patrol that border, looking for ways to prevent that screwworm from getting into the U.S., but I didn't see anything regarding anything about her reopening the border, and that sure wasn't put out there before the futures closed today. But that being said, live cattle, October down 230 at 229.97, December at 231.92 down 220, and February 233.22 down 202. Feeders were the big losers today. September down 482 at 350.40, October 345.80 down 655, November 343.25 down 722. Lean hogs for October $1.05 lower, 97.12. December 88.62 down 62, February 90.37 down 20 cents. Taking a look at our tracking measures, the Missouri Stocker formula on Friday, based roughly on a 550-pound steer through the auction barns in the state of Missouri, 427.96. The CME Cash Feeder Cattle Index, based roughly on an 800-pound steer through the 12-state feeding region, at 363.08. When we look at our cash prices around the state this week that went through the auction barns, sure enough, lost $10 on those calves. There was some spots that were sharply lower than that on some of the less attractive ones. The yearlings, they were probably down a full $5 as well. Box beef cutout values. Choice closed on Friday at $400.04. That was down $10.72 for the week. Select at $378.44, down $6.75 for the week. Turning our attention to those grain markets, cash bids around the state today. The soybeans were 12 to 13 cents higher. Wheat was 2 cents higher. Corn 10.11 higher. Corn bids on Friday in the St. Louis region, 428 to 429. Kansas City at 407. Soybean bids, St. Louis at 1019, Kansas City 961. Wheat bids in St. Louis 461 to 463. Closes on the Board of Trade on Friday. Corn, September was unchanged at $3.99. Of course, all those September contracts will expire on Monday, so very little volume left with any of the Septembers. December new crop corn was up 10 1/4 at 4.30. March up 10 at 4.47 1/4. September beans 10 1/2 higher, 10.25 3/4. November new crop up 12 3/4 at 10.46 1/4. January up 12 3/4 at 10.65 1/4. Wheat contracts, September was unchanged at 5.03. December up 2 at 5.23 1/2. March at 5.41, up 2 3/4. Soybean meal, no trade on the September today. It was unchanged, 288.30. The October was up $1.50 a ton at 287.60. Soybean oil for September up 56 cents a hundredweight at 51.38. October up 59 cents at 51.67. With the Missouri Department of Agriculture, that's a recap of your markets for this week. This is Tony Hancock.